Today's topic is job order costing, and this topic is going to be split into two videos. The first video is going to be about the hows and whys of doing job order costing, um, the procedures, a little background on some accounting review to understand what we're doing with the job order costing. And then the second video in job order costing will be examples of problems out of your book that I want to keep separate from this. So the first thing is when we talk about types of costing, in general, it's broken down into two different areas. We have job order costing and we have process costing. There's a number of different things, but um, uh, like standard costing is an offshoot of job order costing. Activity based costing is an offshoot of job order costing. Um, so this is kind of the underlying basis of several different costing methods that we will use. Now, the idea here is in job order costing, we have the abilities and skills to do certain things, but every job is a little bit different or a little bit unique when we do them. For example, if we took like a welding shop, um, a very large welding shop, we may be welding gates for ranches um, for one job, and we might be welding trailers for another job. And we might get an order for basketball goals. And so all of those take the same skill set, but different amounts of time and energy and materials go into each of those different products that we put out. The process costing is when we make the same thing over and over and over and over again. Think about like a soda bottler or a pharmaceutical pill manufacturer. They're just making thousands and thousands and thousands of the same thing on a constant assembly line. Um, a beer bottler would be similar. So in that case, we use a process, and that's going to be the next topic we talk about. We're going to skip activity-based costing in this class. Um, and so um, when we do that, when we do job order costing, there's a certain number of things we need to do. So the first thing we need to understand is how we accumulate overhead. The direct materials, like we talked about in the last topic, the direct materials are directly traced to a product. The direct labor is directly traced to a product, but overhead is allocated, right? That means basically we make an estimate of how much it's going to be. And so I'm going to go into here, I'm going to go into how we accumulate um, the overhead amounts, and then how we apply the overhead or allocate. Apply and allocate is used interchangeably. And then how we're going to reconcile, because we're using an application that is an estimate. So we know we're going to be off at the end of the year. And so we have to reconcile that at the end of the period. So let's talk a little bit about why we use this estimate. And it's hard for students because when I do a problem, particularly a problem where I'm going to ask you to reconcile at the end of the year, that means you're going to know the actual numbers. Well, why would I use an estimate when I know the actual numbers? And the fact is, when we go through the year, right, I'm not going to know what that number is going to be. I'm not going to know how much I had to spend on heating. I'm not going to know how much I had to spend on janitor salaries. If we're like around here and unemployment's low, I'm paying janitors more so that I can have one. And so I don't know what my costs are going to be. I don't know what my taxes are going to be until the end of the year, and I can put this all in the formula. But throughout the year, I have to use estimates to do two things. One, I need to bid on jobs, right? And when I bid on jobs, I need to be as close as possible. If I underbid, then I'm going to lose money or at least not make as much money as I think I'm making. And if I overbid, then I'm going to lose out on jobs altogether. So I don't want to be too far over, too far under. Honestly, accountants tend to overbid just a little so they don't have to go to their boss and say, "Oh, I was underestimated." Right. But you don't want to be wildly over. You don't want to come in and, wow, we made a whole bunch more than we thought we did. That's just as bad because you're losing out on jobs that way. Um, so it's important that we make our estimates as close as we can as possible. And probably a good controller in normal times, something like COVID doesn't happen. In normal times, a good controller will probably be within 2 or 3%, um, one way or the other, when they make their estimates of how much it's going to be. That assumes that we don't go into a recession, or if we're in a recession, we don't suddenly, job doesn't pick up enormously, that sort of thing. So let's take a look, go to the paper, and let's take a look at how we accumulate funds. All right. Now, in your financial accounting, um, let's say that we that you paid the rent for January for your building. In financial accounting, you put down rent expense. We'll just make it $2,000, and then you put either cash if you paid cash for it, or accounts payable if you haven't quite paid it yet, $2,000, and then you'd make a little note that says for January rent. Right now, of course, we're going to do this electronically on a computer, but this is exactly what happens on the computer when we do it. But if you will remember back to your financial accounting, they should have taught you something called the matching principle in accounting. Now, the matching principle states that I try to match my expenses that go with the revenues those expenses generate. Okay. Now, if we have something like a retail store or a home office that's not manufacturing something, then this entry is correct, right? But if we're using a factory building to manufacture something, that becomes overhead, right? And it's an indirect cost, like we talked about last time, but it is still part of a product cost. So it attaches to the product. So instead of this entry that we did here, our entry will now be rent, will be manufacturing overhead. I'm just going to abbreviate overhead OH. Control for 2,000. And then I'll have the cash or accounts payable for 2,000. Now, this is important. This would be a good time to talk about the difference between a cost and an expense. Right now, this is a cost. It hasn't become an expense until we sell it, till we sell the products that we produce in this factory building, and it becomes an expense as part of cost of goods sold. Okay. So, and that's not unlike what we did when we have like inventory in a merchandising firm. If I buy inventory, right, I'm going to debit inventory. Let's say we bought $60 worth of goods, and I'm going to debit cash or accounts payable. Let's go accounts payable here. Now, this inventory cost for the good that we will sell later is not an expense, it's an asset right now. It's not until we sell it. So when we sell it, it becomes um, accounts receivable, right? And we'll say $100 and sales revenue, $100. But we also have cost of goods sold for $60, and we take it out of inventory for $60. Now, this we purchased here, now it becomes an expense as part of cost of goods sold. Okay. So it's the same thing as that. So in this case, the manufacturing overhead control, we end up with a T account. And we put the actual costs as debits, and then we put the applied costs as credits. Okay, so let's look at how that works. So let's have three overhead transactions here. We're going to have our rent. So we'll have manufacturing overhead control. And our rent will be $2,000, and we'll pay cash for that. And then we're going to have the janitor's salary. So that'll be manufacturing overhead control. And let's say that's $600 for the week, $15 an hour. And we're going to have salaries payable. And let's say that we have utilities like the electric and the gas and all that kind of stuff. That'll be manufacturing overhead control. Oops, off the L there. And let's say $450, and we'll have utilities payable. And that's $450. Now we're going to have a T account, the title of which is manufacturing overhead control. And so when I post, and of course the computer does this automatically, I post these, I get 2,000 here, that one, and I've got 600 here, and I've got 450 here. Now, I'm going to apply overhead as I make things, but it may not be, application may not be exactly this, right? It may not come to $3,050 exactly. Let's say it comes to 2,700 is what I apply. So then what happens is I have $350 balance. And remember that the debit side is the actual, the credit side is the applied. So I am what we call under applied by $350. Now, the way we're going to get rid of that is we're going to, at the end of the year, let's say this was the end of the year. The way I get rid of that now at the end of the year is I'm going to debit cost of goods sold for $350, and I'm going to credit my manufacturing overhead control. And that's going to be $350. And so now I come here, take 350, and I have a zero balance at the end of the year. This is known as a temporal or temporary account because I close it out with an adjusting entry at the end of the year. And hopefully, when we go through some of the examples, this will become a lot clearer about how we do these sorts of things. So that's the first thing. We need to we need to accumulate the expenses, and then the very last thing is we need to make an adjusting entry and reset this account back to zero. Okay, so the next thing we have to do, we're going to make an estimate, and it's called a predetermined overhead rate. And let's just say, and so we look at things, we look at history, we look at how prices have changed, we look at a number of things, we try to estimate the expenses that are going to, or the costs that are going to come up for the year. And we determine that our overhead for the year, assuming everything is normal, is $300,000. Now, we can use anything. Remember, we talked in the last class about cost drivers. And so there are a number of things that generally work as cost drivers in job order costing. But in job order costing, we only use one. That's why it's a single plant wide rate. Okay. And so we can use direct labor hours, the number of hours that are worked by direct laborers. We can use direct labor cost. So why would we use different things? Well, let's say that the overhead is basically the factory, and we have two factory workers. We have assembly people and we have machinists. We pay the machinists um, $35 an hour, and we pay the assembly people $18 an hour, roughly half, just a little over half. And but the overhead that's used in this factory pretty much is just the lights, the heat, the taxes on the building, that sort of thing. And so direct labor hours might be very beneficial. On the other hand, let's say that, because we've got one or two machinists and that's it. On the other hand, if we have a heavy machine based industry, very few assembly people, so we've got a majority machine, or maybe it's split half and half. Well, the machinists, those machines use electricity. Those machines will have depreciation on them. And so now, since we pay $35 an hour for machinists, but only $18 for assembly people, we might use, and machinists have these additional items of overhead that are going to be incurred. We might use it based on direct labor cost. Instead of basing it on the hours they work, we base it on the amount we pay these people. So that may be one thing to do it. If we had a case where it's all machinists, but maybe some are skilled machinists or some are apprentice machinists, then we pay different amounts. Then it might be based on machine hours, because the machines are the cost driver of this overhead. So it can be any particular thing, but those are the three most common: direct labor hours, direct labor cost, or machine hours. Those are the three most common in job order costing. So let's say that we're going to do it based on direct labor hours, and we're going to have 20,000 direct labor hours. Now, just as a side note, a basic rule of thumb, a worker works 50 weeks a year, 40 hours a week. An individual worker works on average 2,000 hours a year, so 2-week vacation, a few holidays in there, etc. Right. So 2,000 hours is a normal work period for the normal worker. So this says we've got about 10 direct labor workers if we're going to use direct labor hours, right? So all we do is we take the 300,000, divide it by the 20,000, right? And so we get 30 divided by 2 is $15 per direct labor hour. That's going to be our predetermined overhead rate. Now, when we get the cost sheet, right, the cost sheet's going to have all the materials we've requested from inventory, the direct materials we've requested from inventory, and it's going to have a worksheet, where workers check in. This is done electronically today. Workers will often have a computer or workstation at their workplace, and they punch in which job they're working on a particular day. And so this will be done electronically as well. But we have a $15 per hour overhead rate. So let's say this particular job used 45 hours. We would say 45 times 15, and that's going to be 375, or sorry, $675 that we will apply to overhead. And so that will be, we'll apply that to the job, and that entry will be manufacturing overhead control, 675. And then that will be, that will go to, I'm sorry, this is the applied, I did that backwards. So this is going to be work in process, whatever the job number is, let's just call it 325. And that'll be 675. And we do the applied to manufacturing overhead control, 675. And if we were to look in our T account, we would post that 675 on the credit side. Okay. So that's how that's going to work as that goes. And then finally, let's say in this case that we're going to do a quarterly statement, and let's say it's 500. So now when I do this, I've actually applied 175 too much. And so to get rid of this and zero it out, and again, this is an adjusting entry that only happens at the end of the period, usually a year in a small company, quarterly if it's a bigger company. It's going to be, our entry will be manufacturing overhead control, 175, cost of goods sold, 175, and we post the 175 here, and we go to zero. Now I get to go in. Now remember, cost of goods sold is an expense, right? And so that means that I get to go into the boss and say, boss, I got great news, right? Because expenses are increased on the debit side, decreased on the credit side. And so I get to go into the boss and say, boss, great news. We made 175 more than we thought we did. Woohoo, right? And so that's because we were over applied on that. All right. So, so that's kind of the basics of how things work in job order costing. And I'm going to stop this video here, and then we will start working on some problems in the next video.